Hello and welcome to Graywood Gardening. Today we're going to talk about the 2021 gardening plan for all of Graywood. So basically, instead of doing any actual work, I'm just going to talk about all the work that I plan on doing all year long. So let's get started with the Cottage Garden. We put in the entire Cottage Garden last year, so this will be the Cottage Garden's second year. Now, there are some areas that we had annuals that we'll need to put in new annuals or cut perennials there. We'll need to replace the annual border. There are some known holes, and I might want to move the New England aster. And we want to try growing sweet peas for the first time. But for the most part, we're not going to be doing a ton of changes here in the Cottage Garden. This year will pretty much be a year of observation because we mostly planted perennials, some of them that I started from seeds, some of them that we got from the garden center. The way the garden looked last year was not at all representative of how it's going to look going forward. And so really, this year we'll get to see what it kinda is going to look like for the first time as we see the more mature perennials that are spreading and taking up more space, and we can get an idea of what it's going to look like and make plans to change it from there. One thing I do plan on doing this year is keeping a journal of every weekend. I'm going to make a note of what is blooming in the Cottage Garden and whether it feels like there's enough blooming or if it feels like, oh, there's like nothing blooming in front or nothing blooming in back. And so I'll be able to take that the following year and plan to add plants with specific bloom periods based on any place that feels a little bit empty. But so for the most part, plenty of work to be done. This is a decent sized garden, lots of upkeep and like I said, a few things to add here and there. But for the most part, this is going to be a year of observation and watching to see what it becomes. It's going to look like a transformed garden. That transformation is going to be because of the plants maturing rather than us doing tons and tons of work. All right, let's take a look over here. This is the lower terrace garden. It's across the driveway and down a little bit from the Cottage Garden. It's really right on the edge of where the Wildflower Meadow area begins. So we have the very front edge of the lower terrace garden planted with tete-a-tete daffodils, which you can see coming up now. And right behind those are some New England aster. But most of this entire bed was filled with annuals last year. So this year the plan is we're going to try to direct seed Echinacea and Rudbeckia across this entire bed. I don't have room in the seed starting layer to actually start them inside, so hopefully the direct seeding approach is going to work just fine. The goal here, at least for the next several years, is to make a fairly low maintenance bed that we don't need to do a lot of work in because we have lots of work we want to do elsewhere for the next several years. We found a couple of mixes. We found a Rudbeckia mix and an Echinacea mix that are very like warm autumn colored blooms. So if we can get the direct seeding to take, and if they bloom this year, which the Rudbeckia should, the Echinacea I'm not sure about, it should look really, really beautiful, and it should be a pretty maintenance-free bed going forward because the Rudbeckia and Echinacea are strong plants that are going to spread and should outcompete most weeds that want to grow here. All right, just up the driveway from the lower terrace garden is the upper terrace garden. Now right here along the edge, we planted some peonies last year and they're starting to come up, so we can't have done it too wrong. We have a couple perennials in front, but then the shrubs in back right there is forsythia, and they will eventually take over most of this space, but it'll take a few years. So in the meantime, the plan is we are going to take little Graywood to the garden center, and she'll be 3 this year, and we're going to let her pick out whatever plants she wants to put here. We might lean her a little bit in the direction of annuals, but anything she likes we can get and fill in this space, and this will become the little Graywood's garden. Last summer, we just finished having this new front porch put on the house, and so now we need to dig out this area in front of it to make a new front porch garden. This is all rocks and rubble and landscape fabric and random hunks of plastic edging. Well, I want to dig all of this out at least 1 foot deep, and underneath of it is all sand that drains beautifully. Backfill it with garden soil or topsoil and compost, and at least get a good start on putting in a new garden. Now, Mrs. Graywood has determined that the primary purpose of this garden is going to be to plant lilies, preferably her oriental lilies. We can plant those in the spring, but that means I've got to get this garden built soon. We have a lot of deer here, and the deer love to eat lilies. So the hope is, because we're all the way up against the house, the deer won't be willing to come this close to actually eat the lilies. I think that's probably going to work out well. Ooh, and right over here on the other side of the sidewalk, I have this crazy idea that we should take this whole side of the sidewalk, sort of cut the grass back up here somewhere, and all in here we should plant Roman chamomile, which is the creeping form of chamomile. So it is a ground cover. It's supposed to tolerate light traffic, so that'll work fine for when little graywood's running around. It obviously will smell fantastic, and once a year it'll bloom in these little white daisy-like flowers. I think it would be the perfect setting for it in around these rocks. The only one problem is, I'm pretty sure Roman chamomile is technically zone 5 and not zone 4. So a little questionable if it'll survive. Normally, I would argue that this is the perfect location for a zone 5 perennial. Because it's right next to the sidewalk. That means that all winter long, I'm shoveling snow over here, which gives us like a really good mound of insulation that lasts a lot longer than the rest of the snow cover does. The downside is this sidewalk, it can get pretty deadly slippery in the winter. So this is the one place that I'm pretty aggressive using salt and other ice melt, depending on the temperature. So I am concerned not just with what happens if we get a really cold winter, but also the impact of dumping all of this salt and other chemicals right onto the chamomile. So I think there's at least a 50-50 chance that this is going to die. That is not going to stop me from trying. I have a tray downstairs in the seed starting layer right now filled with Roman chamomile that just started sprouting, and I should have about 100 plugs of it to plant out this spring. And I am way more excited about this than I should be. I think this is going to be a super awesome experiment. So in between the cottage garden and the veggie garden, we have this hill that we call the Mound Garden. Mrs. Graywood's vision of this is to be a little bit more wild than the cottage garden and to be planted with a lot of meadow plants. So we have echinacea and rudbeckia and some daisies and some coreopsis. We also just tossed in some allium to get something blooming a little bit early. The other big goal of this garden was to dig up as much of the weeds as we could along this rock wall and plant a bunch of creeping phlox both on the top and partway down into the wall, with the goal that in several years we'll probably have like a wall full of creeping phlox, which would look lovely. So we're very happy with this. It's pretty low maintenance. We don't worry about even weeding this that often. So probably we'll add a little bit more and expand the garden going down further and add some more creeping phlox. But otherwise, this garden, it just needs more of the same. The primary focus of 2021 at Graywood, I think, is going to be the veggie garden. The veggie garden got off to a really late start last year, and most of that's because we had to first build this giant deer fence to keep the deer out, or nothing we grew would survive for long. So we got a decent number of raised beds in last year. I think we have 8 big ones and 2 little ones. My big goal for this year is to have a lot more growing in the veggie garden, including a bunch of flowers growing in with the veggies, and to have the in-ground beds prepped so that I can grow some of the raspberries and asparagus and rhubarb next year. So right now we have the 8 big raised beds. I want to get 5 more large raised beds and 2 more small ones. We're not sure if we're actually going to do that many because of the cost of lumber is so high. Mrs. Graywood isn't thrilled about me buying that much lumber, so we might narrow that number down a little bit. So we also plan on having in-ground beds along the fences here. Now the problem is our ground here is pure sand, like literally imagine playground sand that's 100 feet deep. So in order to grow anything here, I first need to dig these out to at least a foot, maybe as much as 3 feet, depending on what I'm growing, and backfill it with some sort of garden soil or topsoil. In addition to that, I want to get some trellises, some arbor trellises made out of cattle panel, put in the garden so that I can be growing stuff over the pathways. And the idea is one of these sides of the fence, we want to be growing raspberries and blackberries. Not going to plant that yet this year, but I want to get that bed ready to plant, and I'll probably plant some cucumbers or gourds or something that can vine up the fence this year. Another one of these, I want to be planting asparagus. So that one will probably need to get dug fairly deeply. In addition to everything that we want to do in the veggie garden, I also want to build one small, low, raised bed outside the veggie garden, because I was reading some articles on all the veggies that are deer-proof. And I'm frankly a little suspicious about most of them, but I want to give it a shot. We have really aggressive deer that come through the property almost every day. And just outside the veggie garden, we have this apple tree. I want to put, where the deer are there all the time, I want to put a little raised bed there, and I want to grow a list of all the veggies that people say are deer-proof, which include peppers and tomatoes and onions and garlic and some other stuff. I want to grow it all there, and we'll see what the deer actually leave alone. I have a hunch that they're going to eat everything except for the onions and garlic. Basically everything that isn't in the allium family they're going to eat is my theory, but I will be incredibly happy to be proven wrong. So we're going to give that a test this year. But yeah, so the goal is a beautiful veggie garden that is very productive. We want to get more veggies. We're going to do a lot of veggie trials this year, so trying different varieties, see what works for us, but also growing lots of flowers in here, having the arbors, making it a beautiful place to stay. Long term, we do want to have a small greenhouse in the veggie garden. No chance we're going to start on that this year. We also want to have a medium-sized potting shed and storage shed in the veggie garden over on the shady side. I think it's incredibly unlikely we'll do that, again, given the price of lumber. So what we might do in the meantime is get one of those like canvas portable garage things and use that as a storage shed just so we can start getting some junk out of the garage. All right, let's go take a look at the meadow. So the Wildflower Meadow that we planted last year is pretty much going to be on autopilot this year. I am super eager to see if in our wildflower seed mix, if a bunch of those perennials successfully established last year, and hopefully we'll get a huge new variety of flowers blooming, including some blooming much earlier in the year. Of course, there's also a possibility that all of the prairie grasses that also managed to find their way here are going to take over and choke out most of the flowers. We'll find out. There were a few bare patches in the Wildflower Meadow last year, and my plan is to dump a big load of dirt on those, spread it out, and reseed those with a new wildflower mix, or maybe even like a single variety of wildflowers, well, like a nice little patch of one kind of flower. In addition to that, at the far back of the meadow, where the big pile of logs used to be, so there aren't really any wildflowers growing there, I plan to make a bunch of mounds of dirt, so hills that I'm going to grow pumpkins on. And according to the internets, the deer will not eat the pumpkin plants. So we're going to put that to the test by making some hills, growing some jack-o'-lanterns on hills, and seeing how it works out. The one other thing we might do here in the meadow is we might plant some staghorn sumac back near the tree line. I'm a huge fan of staghorn sumac, and I definitely think we need something to sort of transition us from the meadow into the woods, and that'll be a good start. All right, I think that is the highlights of our plans for 2021. We have definitely tried to be less ambitious this year than we have been in the past, because last year, I swear it felt like half the things that I was dreaming of doing at the start of the year we didn't get to. Whereas this year, this list feels super accomplishable and should even leave room for all that new stuff that comes up that you never think of. So it'll be very interesting to see what we actually end up accomplishing at the end of this year compared to what our plan was at the beginning. Okay, that is everything I have for you on this video. I will see you next time when we actually start executing on this plan. So until then, happy gardening.